I will stand up. Do we have to? I will stand up.
Okay. Good idea.
Because I have to see the presentation.
Sí, yo también, ¿eh?
Thumbs up? Yes. Great. Oops, I forgot to. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Wilson Center. It's nice to see you all here. As you know, we are less than a week away from a historic election in Mexico. We are delighted to have with us three of the leading experts in Mexico on politics, both executive, presidential, legislative, state level, etc. This is a hand-picked panel. It wasn't just three people we found randomly on the streets of Mexico City. Delighted to have Jorge Buendia, who is a global fellow with the Mexico Institute, back with us again. His last presentation here a few months ago on the election race really left a big mark. So Jorge will be giving us an overview in a couple of minutes about the where we stand in the polling numbers. Many of you already know what what the presidential race looks like, but Jorge has got a whole bunch of other data in there that will give you extra texture on that. Delighted to have with us Joy Langston. Joy is not an old friend, a long-time friend from Mexico. She works at the CIDE University and is an expert on state-level politics, on the PRI and on governors in Mexico in particular. So I've asked her to talk about what will be happening at the state level. And last but by no means least, Eric Magar from the ITAM, a former colleague of mine from the Political Science Department. Great to have you here, Eric. Eric will be talking to us about legislative politics. So I hope that we will have three opening presentations of about 15 to 20 minutes each, and then we should have half an hour for Q&A. So without any further ado, Jorge, I'm going to ask you to lead us off.
Well, thank you, Duncan. Thank you to the Mexico Institute for the invitation. Come to give you an overview of electoral preference at this moment, just 5 days before the election takes place. I'm going to be using the poll of polls developed by Oraculus, which is a polling aggregator that you may already know. This morning, or last night and this morning, two polls were published, and this aggregation of polls show the incorporation of these two polls. Probably the news about these two polls that were published yesterday and today is that the advantage of Ricardo Anaya over Jose Antonio Meade is only 2-3 percentage points, unlike the other polls that have been published in the past. But still, the poll of polls show a more or less comfortable lead of 5 percentage points of Anaya over Meade. If you look at the data right now, it's a huge advantage for López Obrador. It's about 20 percentage points, 47 to 27. So if you look at the Mexico newspapers and the Mexican media, you will see that there is a lot of debate about who's going to be in the second place. And if you look at the ads and the declarations, the statements made by either Jose Antonio Meade or Ricardo Anaya, you would think that they are giving a very serious fight for the second place. So this is kind of incredible. That has been the logic of the campaign, because as you can see, López Obrador is the only candidate that has increased its lead since the beginning of the campaign. If you look at the aggregate numbers, for instance, López Obrador in February had about 39 percentage points in electoral preferences, and right now it's about 47, 48. And if you compare these numbers with November, December of late last year, López Obrador has increased his support about 10, 12 percentage points. And the other candidates haven't moved that much. So probably the most important event took place in February, when there were all these criticism or accusations of money laundering against Ricardo Anaya, which translated into an increase in support for López Obrador, and Anaya just remaining with the same level of support. But this was probably the key moment, and I will show you later some figures that support this view. So today, it's very clear who the leader is. This is not a parliamentary system or like the US where the electoral college decides who wins. So it's very clear that López Obrador has a very big advantage. And I want to emphasize this. I mean, what would happen for López Obrador to lose? People talk about polling mistakes in the past, but you would need a very catastrophic event or that polls were really, really wrong for this result not to be true, because the advantage is so huge on the one hand. You can see the different polls that have different percentages for López Obrador. Actually, this is a polling average, 47%, but just 1 week ago, 10 days ago, there were polls that were giving López Obrador a level of support above 50%. So even with a 10 points error by the polls, I mean, López Obrador would still win. And the other thing is that look at the trends. We don't see a trend of the second place going up and first place declining like it happened in 2012, 2006, the 2000 year election. So for me, those are the two things: a very comfortable lead for López Obrador and a trend that is that does not say anything about the second place growing. You can see clearly here how López Obrador has increased its support on the campaign trail. It's very, very clear the level of increase, especially since late December when all the candidates were known. And this is a very important thing because the other candidates just remain stable or decline. There is a lot of volatility, and obviously one of the reasons of electoral volatility in presidential systems are the candidates. How well a party does or how bad it does depends a lot on the identity of the candidates. And you can see also here how opinion about the candidates has changed during the campaign. In November of last year, López Obrador was a divisive figure in Mexican public opinion. 33% had a good opinion about him, 33% had a negative opinion about him. This was more or less like what happened in 2006. The country divided about how good López Obrador would be. But then you can see that his positives begin to increase a lot. And he's the only candidate that has more or less that trend. Meade also improves a lot, but he has more negative than positives. And obviously, the increase in positives for Meade is due to a greater name recognition, but still it's in the negative realm. Anaya, just a very promising start, and then he just stabilized. If you look at the balance of opinion, López Obrador is the only one that has a positive balance of opinion, which means his positives outweigh his negatives. The other two candidates are in the negative area. So this more or less tells you the whole story about the campaign. So what happened at the level of social groups or regional? The first two measures are the official results of 2006 and 2012. And you can see the evolution of support for López Obrador along these 12 years. This is the region of the Pacific North. This was an area, a part of the country that didn't like López Obrador either in 2006 and 2012. You can see that Felipe Calderón was able to win the presidency because he had a very clear advantage of more than 20 percentage points over López Obrador in 2006. In 2012, the story is more or less the same between Peña and López Obrador. López Obrador never got more than 24% of the vote in this northern region of the country. Right now, we are seeing two things: a very clear increase in support for López Obrador in this area, this region. And look also what happened in February of this year. Anaya and López Obrador were tied. But after the accusations of money laundering against Ricardo Anaya, the one who took advantage of that was López Obrador. He increased his support in like 14 percentage points, and Anaya lost about 9 percentage points in this area. So right now it's almost a 2-to-1 relationship between López Obrador and Anaya in this area. And you can see that the PRI has not got any increase in support in this region. So I think that this graph in this region really shows you what happened during the campaign. The accusations of money laundering translated into a decrease in support for Anaya and an increase in support for López Obrador, and the PRI didn't benefit at all from this. Another region that it's very important to take a look is the southern part of Mexico, where the most underdeveloped areas of the country are. You could see that López Obrador in 2006 and 2012 was very competitive in that area. His main opposition was the PRI. Indeed, either in 2006 and 2012, the PRI never got below 30% of support. But then, and this is another important trend that explains what's going on in Mexico right now, there was a very important crisis for the PRI in the states that compose the southern part of Mexico, especially in the state of Veracruz, which is a very large one, where the former PRI governor is now in jail, and the same thing happened with the governor of Quintana Roo. So at the beginning of the campaign, what we have here is that this region just went for López Obrador in an overwhelming way. 60% of support in several polls during this election. Nothing has changed that much since the beginning of the year. This is something that happened either in 2017 or 2016. And look at the decline of the PRI, and hasn't changed that much. And the PAN is doing more or less well, but it's a 3-to-1 advantage of López Obrador over the PAN or the PRI in this region. So this explains a lot why we have right now López Obrador at a level that hasn't been expected, or it is kind of unique in this regard, because we used to have in the past a lot of electoral fragmentation. It was very difficult for a candidate to get past over the threshold of 40% of support, and nowadays we have López Obrador at 47%. Another important change is look at gender. Males have always been a base of support for López Obrador. Usually, the males vote for López Obrador in a higher proportion than females, but that's not the case anymore. What happened in the campaign is that López Obrador was able to gain the female vote, especially after the accusations against Ricardo Anaya. At the beginning of the campaign, there was a tie in the female vote between Anaya and López Obrador, and after the accusations, well, the advantage of López Obrador has increased a lot. Millennials are also part of the explanation of what happened with the dynamics of the campaign. It was a very competitive group at the beginning of the year, but later on, they just went for López Obrador and they abandoned Ricardo Anaya. What López Obrador gained in this group, it's what Anaya lost. And nothing happened with support for José Antonio Meade. So in all these graphs, you can see a lot of stability in support for the PRI, which is also a confirmation that the PRI is already counting on his hardcore supporters. Hasn't moved that much during the campaign. Education is another important story. Unlike what many people think, in 2006, people with low levels of education, which tend to be the poor ones in Mexico, they didn't support López Obrador that much. It was a very competitive group, probably because of official programs from the government, social policy. But right now, especially during the campaign, support for López Obrador among this group has increased to 50%. In previous election was only 36, 28% of support for López Obrador. But the story of the campaign is also illustrated with the better educated people in Mexico. In 2006, this group was not convinced of López Obrador. Actually, they voted more for Felipe Calderón. These people with college education tend to be the better off in society, so you can also argue that this was kind of a social class vote, and this group was not with López Obrador in 2006. And nowadays, since the beginning of the campaign, it was clearly in favor of López Obrador. So to sum up some of these figures, you can see that the advantage that López Obrador has is more or less the same among all social groups. Unlike the past, there is not a division in Mexican society. Let's say some regions support him, some regions oppose him, some social groups are against him. Nowadays, we see that López Obrador is the front runner in these different social groups. I want to close with issues. Corruption, which is the most pressing issue for the Mexican public that needs to be solved. Insecurity is one of them. 40% say so. 27% says corruption. Economic conditions, 50%. And you see clearly that López Obrador has the advantage on the issue of corruption. People who think that corruption is the most pressing issue, almost half of them supports López Obrador. This is an issue that clearly benefits López Obrador. Look at support for Anaya. Doesn't change that much depending on the issue that you care about. Probably he does a little bit better with people that think about insecurity. And Meade is in a very clear third place, regardless of which is the issue that you care the most about. The story with a different set of questions. What should be the priority of the next government? Corruption. Also, people who care more about corruption supports more López Obrador than people that say that insecurity should be the top issue. So corruption is playing to the advantage of López Obrador, although it's not a very clear-cut issue. López Obrador does pretty well regardless of the issue that you care about. It's only that his level of support decreases a little bit more. NAFTA. 67% of the Mexican population supports NAFTA, says that it's good for the Mexican economy. And you don't see differences in support for the candidates depending on your attitudes toward NAFTA. Support for López Obrador is more or less the same regardless of your opinion about NAFTA, and it has not become an issue during this campaign. And probably what is most striking about this data is that the Mexican public is really in favor of NAFTA, probably because if Trump doesn't like NAFTA and Mexican people doesn't like Trump, ergo we want NAFTA. 68% say that Mexico should continue in NAFTA, and also you don't see changes in electoral support for the candidates depending on their attitudes toward NAFTA. So to sum up, what we are looking right now, it's a very comfortable lead of López Obrador. We don't see a trend that the second place is growing, so which makes more difficult to catch up with López Obrador. Just remember 6 years ago, President Peña was going down in the polls when the election took place. López Obrador was going up, and then the difference of 7 percentage points that came as a surprise. To some extent, you could see the trend that this may actually have happened before. But now we are not seeing those trends. The preferences have been more or less stable, and if the second place doesn't increase his level of support, he's never going to catch López Obrador. And second, we don't see a society as divided regarding López Obrador as in the past. Nowadays, he's getting support from all the important socioeconomic groups that we have analyzed in the polls. It's not a society that it's as polarized regarding López Obrador. And also this explains why the negative campaign hasn't worked out for the PRI or for the PAN. The Mexican public, as you saw in the figures, in the balance of opinion towards López Obrador, nowadays doesn't have a highly negative or highly critical view of López Obrador as it used to have in the past. Nowadays, positive opinions about López Obrador are twice the size of the negative opinions. And that tells you a lot about the dynamic of this election. And I will stop at this.
Jorge, thank you very much for that. I could see a lot of people taking photographs of the slides. We will have everything on our website shortly after the presentation. So don't worry about that. And I want to thank you all for being here. As you can see, this is a sold-out event. If you didn't get your tickets on Ticketmaster on time, I'll point you to StubHub next time, okay? We're now going to move on to Eric Magar, actually, to talk about the legislative perspective or outlook. And so whilst we load up the presentation, Eric, would you, I don't know where you want to sit or whether you want to stand?
I want to stand.
Okay, perfect. The microphone is yours.
Thank you. Well, while my presentation is being uploaded, I'm Eric Magar from ITAM. Just F5.
It's Magar WWC.
That's it.
Up top.
I know it's that one, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so it's everything is set up. I come from ITAM in Mexico City, and I will be speaking of the congressional races in the next Sunday. As you probably know, all seats in Mexico's bicameral Congress are up for grabs next Sunday. And this has been a much less salient election than the horse race in the presidential, for the presidential seat. Yet, I will try to argue that it's equally important. We can expect very important changes in this congressional election. Although the forecast is a bit harder to do because unlike presidential races, there is very little polling that is actually relevant to compute the expectations. Yet, I mean, I will try to produce a little guesstimate based on some of the information that is around. Okay, so you probably know that Mexico's electoral system has some elements that are like the US's and others that make it different. We have a mixed electoral system. in the lower chamber, the Cámara de Diputados, voters have one vote, which they give to one candidate in their district. But that district, basically, there's a winner decided by plurality in the district, but then the vote carries on to a proportional representation parallel track where party seats are distributed by a percentage of vote shares to parties. In the upper chamber, you also have one vote that you give to two candidate list in your state. The voter with the party or the list with the plurality gets both 2 seats. Then the runner-up gets an extra seat, and then there's 32 extra seats distributed by proportional representation. So there's this is not too different from the German system, but it's quite different from the American. So Morena, which is López Obrador's party, signed up a coalition agreement with 2 other parties. They've actually all 3 major candidates are running on multi-party coalitions. And Morena's is made up of 2 new parties, his own, Morena, a formerly fringe party, the Partido del Trabajo, PT, and an evangelical party, the PES. So it's actually a pretty odd coalition. But what is striking is that these coalition agreements have to distribute the pie ex ante. And the distribution is quite surprising once you see that the small partners got incredibly large shares of seats or of nominations. If you look, the left side column is nominees for federal districts. There's 300 districts. And of those, half of them have a Morena candidate, but the other half are basically split between an evangelical, at least formally an evangelical, and other are for PT. And given what the numbers that we saw with Jorge and the potential for single-member district wins that the coalition might have, that will bring actually a substantial amount of formerly very small or non-existent parties into the chambers. If you look at the Senate, there's these 2-member lists that are ranked, and there's 19 of 32 states, or 20 because there's one with no coalition, where both names come from Morena. But then there's 12 states where only one or none come from López Obrador's party. So he actually gave up a huge prize to the minor coalition parties, and the question, that's a big puzzle. Why did this actually happen? There's also the possibility that some of these are what usually called watermelons, that could be Morena types that are just pretending to be nominated by the other party, but we don't really know much about that. Those are things that we'll have to discover or investigate further later. Now, predicting the lower house is actually the tough call because there's no district level polling. There are a few polls at the state level, but those tend to be to lack representative samples for the states, and they do not give a good idea of how the vote is distributed geographically, which makes sense. It's actually important to know which districts might be won by López Obrador's huge margins in the states. In the past, the PAN, for example, used to win, have lots of votes concentrated in the capitals, in the cities, and not so much in the countryside. That may be changing, but really we have no clue about all this. So whether this translates into a landslide of single-member seat victories for López Obrador or not remains to be seen. But basically, I will use a very simple rule of thumb. If we take López Obrador's coalition percentage of votes, that should fairly translate into a percentage of seats that they might win. And given the seat distribution, we should basically expect half of those to go for Morena candidates and 1/4 each for the 2 minor partners. So there's one advantage in trying to guess what there's a thingy here, yeah. Oh, no, it doesn't work. Well, trying to guess what the percentage of votes for diputados is not too hard in Mexico because presidential coattails tend to be much larger than in the US. Basically, at the end of the 19th century in the US, there was basically a one-on-one relationship between an extra point in the presidential race would basically buy that party the presidential candidate's party an extra point in Congress. That's been eroding in the past century. But in Mexico, at least for the left, because there's distinct degrees for different parties, but the PRE, which is the former party that López Obrador abandoned some years ago, used to have basically a half-point correlation between presidential votes and congressional votes. So given that this is a new party, we could expect very large presidential coattails. And if you look at the signs and the campaign signs in Mexico, you typically see López Obrador and one of the lower ticket candidates across the country. So the coattails should be high, and we could take basically Oraculus's numbers for the presidential race as a good rule of basically guess of what the congressional vote might look like. And given that, we could basically, with a 50% vote for AMLO, Anaya at 28 and Meade at 19, and then splitting this with the parties, we can expect basically, this is a floor, I think a 50% share of seat, a majority for Morena candidates, if not more. And the question is what happens with the opposition, whether the PAN and the PRI actually hold on to their respective votes inside their own coalitions remains to be seen. But what will happen in the lower chamber of Congress is that we will experience a non-PRI unified government for the first time since Mexico became democratic. And that's actually a major shift in what we have been experiencing in the country. Whether or not the coalition, which is quite diverse, holds on or not in hard times also remains to be seen, but that will be something to be looking forward, a coalition for the president's party, or basically a majority for the president's coalition. And on the other hand, whether the PAN, which will be the largest, or presumably the largest opposition party, actually manages to hold them accountable depends on whether they themselves are not subject to internal warfare, given their disaster result. And so this looks like a very different Congress than what we've been seeing in the last decade and a half or 2 decades. Now, for the upper chamber, it's a little easier given the rules. We just need to know which coalition comes in first or second in each state. There's not a definite result there, but we could just some guesswork. We could think that AMLO's coalition should come first in at least 29 states, maybe 3 for the Frente. Then second places would mostly fall for the Frente, but basically split evenly among the rest, with 1 independent candidate in Jalisco. And basically would have a Senate that is even much more strongly controlled by the president's or the future president's coalition than the lower house, with again the PAN as the potentially big opposition party. Whether or not that becomes relevant or not remains to be seen. But there's another, I would just like to touch some other aspects that should make this a very important, let us expect important changes. If we look at Morena's, the party's nomination methods, they use a very odd, or at least not uncommon nomination rule. For single member districts, basically half the districts are selected randomly and appointed by the national party, which is common in Mexico. And then district parties, the party affiliates in each district, elect the other half of the 300 single-member districts. But for the proportional representation lists, every third name is basically nominated by the national party, and the other 2 are elected by chance, by lottery, Athenian democracy. Basically, every district sends 10 names for a national lottery, and 2/3 of the proportional representation list come up randomly. And the rationale for this is basically to avoid the secular factionalism in the Mexican left. They've been infighting since they became basically a party, or several parties. And this is one way to basically restrict machine politics inside the party. But at least that's what they claim. But the question remains of what the expected behavior of these 3 types of basically the randomly selected party basis versus the national-based appointees will look like. And another thing that's important to keep in mind is that something that has been characteristic of Mexican politics since 1934 has been single-term limits, and those are off the books now. In 2014, they were surprisingly removed from our constitution, and now federal deputies can re-elect up to 4 consecutive terms, senators up to 2 consecutive terms. They need to be re-nominated by the same party that elected them. There's sort of a party clause there. And this actually kicks off the next midterm election. So this will be the first slate of candidates that could, if they were interested in, have a longer horizon in their legislative career by trying to cultivate their constituents and not just trying to get a new appointment or a new nomination next. So there's potentially a huge change here. There's also big limits. If we see, just looking at other democracies that allow re-election in Latin America, there's not all of them actually have some of them have big turnover rates. Argentina perhaps has the least returning legislators since the democratic times. 15% approximately. Brazil and Chile rise up to 42 and 59, and this basically is a big contrast with the case of the United States, where it's basically universal. No, you get more than 3/4 of incumbents returning every congressional election. Now, if we look at the 1920s very fast, Mexico allowed re-election back then, legislative re-election, and the rates of return actually didn't look too bad, given that we weren't even democratic back then. But by the end, before the reform, when they were 1934, we're approximating Brazil nowadays in the Mexican chamber. So whether that actually happens again or not remains to be seen, but at least there should be something else to be looking at, given in this new slate of legislators. I will skip these for the sake of time. So to wrap up, there's major changes in Congress to be expected, and this wouldn't be the slight or incremental changes that we've been experiencing over the past 3 or 4 decades. This will actually amount to a discrete jump. We are probably going to experience the unified non-PRI government for the first time, with a very split opposition. A new party system is likely. I didn't have time to produce that graph, but if we look at the vote share and the share of seats that the 3 major parties have won in the last elections, they typically amounted to at least 80%. And that will no longer be true. The PRI, the PAN, and the PRD combined are not even gonna capture 50% of the votes and seats, and that is basically a massive change. And we will see a majority of 2 newcomers, Morena and the evangelicals, with a formerly fringe, I don't know what to expect, party, and probably new entrants will be on the rise. And re-election kicks in the next round. So this will be an altogether different, at least in potential, set of events in Mexico's congressional elections. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric. Excellent. Well, you set us up perfectly for the grand finale, looking at what's going to be happening at the state level in these elections on Sunday. Joy, thank you for being here with us. Admired your work for a long time, so delighted to have you presenting to us.
Thank you so much. Right. Well, I think all of our talks are going basically in the same direction, which is, you know, when Jorge opened it up, it's another historical election in Mexico, and they've all been historic since basically, you know, 1988 or 1994, because something new and different and interesting happens. And they were always elections that were leading to more democracy rather than less democracy, more stability rather than less stability. And what I think is interesting in this 2018 elections is that something is coming to an end, which is the Mexican party system, and something we don't know, and this I think is something you pointed out just a few seconds ago, something is coming and we don't really know what it is, and we don't know if it's going to be good for democracy and stability or if it's going to be bad for democracy and stability. So let's get this show on the road. I'm going to talk today about state elections. After Mexican government officials and Mexican politicians love to change electoral rules. So in fact, I don't really know whether it was a 2014 change or a 2008 change or when it happened. But it was one of the later changes at which brought into line several of the state governorships, which used to be staggered pretty much equally across the 6-year sexenio, the 6-year presidential term. Now at least 9 governorships are being held on the same day as the presidential elections. Why does this matter? It matters because it's cheaper. It's good because it should bring in more participation because people are very interested in presidential elections and maybe slightly less interested in gubernatorial elections. So this should bring up voter participation, which is a good thing in a democracy, especially in a new democracy. The problem, however, and I don't think, honestly, several of these party leaders thought of this at the time, when you hold gubernatorial elections at the same time as a presidential election, it may be that you have a good state candidate for your party, but you have a terrible presidential candidate for your party. And what this can mean is that you, as an otherwise good candidate, can lose the election because of presidential coattails. All right, so this is what we may expect. Obviously, in gubernatorial elections, state party matters, state politics does matter a great deal, and so do candidates. So what we see here is something new. This is Morena. Morena is, as both my colleagues have mentioned, Morena is a relatively new party. It was formed by López Obrador, or AMLO, from the dying embers, as I like to call the PRD. The PRD was a unified, and this is why it was so important, it was the unified left party from its formation in 1989, right after the 1988 elections. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas formed it, and it survived as a unified left option until basically the creation of a new party under AMLO that began in like 2012, continued somewhat together in 2015, and finally separated. He finally left the party and took out this new label, which is Morena. So it's the party of regeneration. And what you have here is this new party is about to win. These are the 4 states it will definitely win if the polls are correct. Sometimes that can be a big if in Mexico, but let's just assume that these are correct. So we've got the southern state of Chiapas. We've got Mexico City with almost 9 million voters. We've got Tabasco, and we've got Morelos. Now, what is interesting about this is, obviously, in many of these states, they used to be governed by one of the 3 big parties, right? So in Mexico City, this was a PRD, bastion since it first had elections in 1997, when Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas won very easily, and Mexico City, with all those millions of voters and all that nice money, became a PRD bastion. That is no longer going to be the case. Claudia Sheinbaum, a very close AMLO ally, is going to win that election with very little difficulties. Tabasco was always being fought between the PRI and the PRD. This is one of these southeastern states that Jorge was talking about, where there was bipartisanism, basically, with exceptions. And here what you have is finally the PRD managed to win this election, the last election, 2012, under a former PRI politician who became a PRD politician. And he was a terrible governor. And this helps explain, both in terms of corruption scandals and in terms of, homicidal rates. It was just a very bad governor. And what you see is the Morena candidate is going to win in this state. Then you have Morelos, and this is perhaps the saddest story. This was a PAN sort of redoubt or bastion from 2000 on. This is where the PAN could put any candidate it want, practically, and that candidate would win. Finally, the PRD wins this. It's a very happy occasion for the PRD. And again, bad government, a bad governor. And what happens? Cuauhtémoc Blanco, let's all do this together. He was a football star for America, which is like this really, I don't know, maybe the Dallas Cowboy of the football teams. Cuauhtémoc Blanco is going to be the future governor of a major state of the Mexican Republic. Morelos is relatively small, but is a very important state in many ways. And why? Because, again, you see something very similar. The PAN didn't do a great job as a governor. The PRD did an even worse job as governors. And finally, what you have is Morena moving in and taking advantage of bad government and the López Obrador name and this incredible power he has over voters. So here, now the PAN, I think currently holds either 9 or 11. There are 32 state governorships, including this Mexico City. The PAN holds, I think, about 9 right now, which is a very high number for the PAN. However, of these 9 governorships, it will lose probably all but 1 to 3. So 2 are sort of too tied to make up to be able to call, except for Guanajuato, which has been since something like 1995 a PAN bastion. But there were a lot of PAN bastions back in 1995, and this is the only one that is still left. So it's lost, you know, a lot of states where it used to win, and Guanajuato is the only one left. And, you know, this is sort of its only hope to outright win a state. This is not good for the PAN. The Jalisco again, this is where the PAN won in 1995, and it was a huge deal because Jalisco is a big, rich state with a lot of voters, a lot of resources. So this was also a PAN bastion until the last election held, I think 2012, around then, and finally a PRI member took it back, and he wasn't considered to be a terrible governor. However, for whatever reason, the PAN is basically out of the running in Jalisco. The PRI is far in second place. It's in a second place that it can't win. And this Enrique Alfaro will win the state for Movimiento Ciudadano, which is basically, you know, a very small party. It's not quite as fringy as the PT, but it's somewhat fringy. And they're able to win one of the largest states in the Republic. Yucatan, this is one of the only states where the PRI actually has a chance. It's not, you know, 10 points ahead, 7 points ahead. It's sort of locked into a 1-2 battle with the PAN. And this is it. This is the one state that the PRI can win. And the PRI, as of now, is out of contention in the rest of these states. And if you look at these states, Veracruz, Puebla, Jalisco, Ciudad de Mexico, these are all very large states, above 5 million people. And the rest of them are sort of moderate states with about 2 million voters. What does this mean? This means that the PRI is losing its voter base. And this is a very difficult and dangerous position for the once hegemonic party, the party that came back in 2012, you know, out of nowhere and just beat everyone. And now it is out of contention in these governorships where it once held sway. All right, the PAN could still win 2 more states. Veracruz, very large, Puebla, very large. And it is locked in a battle with Morena candidates. So in fact, the Morena party could also win 2 more states. Depends how the chips fall. And this is interesting because Miguel Angel Yunes is a former priista. And oh, look, that name again, because it's his son running for office against a Morena candidate. So we'll see how that comes out. Puebla, Martha Erika Alonso is the wife of the former PAN sort of governor who was in fact himself a former priista. What this is telling you is that these parties have started to lose the ability to attract new talent, and that there is something that is sort of very corrupt in the state of Denmark or the state of Mexico or the nation of Mexico, which is where you are not pulling in new talent. You are reusing old talent, as in the case of Miguel Barbosa, who's an old-time PRD leader, like sort of this old-time, corrupt, good-natured politician, right? So he sees which way the weather is turning. He jumps to Morena, and he's almost able to beat out the wife of the former governor, okay? All right, so what are the trends? These are just a bunch of states, and I understand it's not too clear. So let's talk about trends. Basically, it's bad for all the parties except for Morena. However, Morena, you can call the Mexican party system through 2015, because I think it's going to change, as Eric was talking about. Basically, it was a three-party system with a bunch of little guys. And then it became a two-party system, two large parties, two medium parties, those medium parties being the PRD and Morena. And what could happen in terms of governorships, which makes a huge difference also in terms of congressional elections down the pike, is that Morena is doing very well and the three large traditional parties are doing very poorly. Now, why would this matter for anything but those state elections? Basically, as I've argued in other work that I've done, is that governors help their co-partisan candidates win elections. Now, the best ones to do this are the pre-governors, without a doubt. This is like part of their job, and they accept it as such. I'm going to help my local deputies, my mayors, my federal deputies, and even my senators win their elections, because that's my job. Either legally, semi-legally, or illegally, that's my job. Now, the PRD and the PAN are not as good at it, basically because of factional problems. But they still help their co-partisans overall. But what is going to happen when you don't have a governor to help you? What does that mean in terms of winning future elections, both at the state and federal level? It means it's going to be much more difficult for you to do so as a politician from one of those old traditional parties. So this is why it's going to matter dramatically how the lower house and the Senate come out, no matter who wins the presidency. So I am making an even stronger argument for the importance of the legislative elections. They matter for the future, and they're going to matter even more when the three major parties, traditionally speaking, lose many of the governorships. So, looks like everything's great for Morena. The problem is Morena is what is called in the trade a personal electoral vehicle, i.e. it's not really a party as such. It is something that AMLO created because he didn't like the rest of the PRD and they wouldn't sort of give him his lead. So the question becomes, and this is a very important question towards the future, is what is going to happen when AMLO is no longer politically active? And we were speaking at lunch about whether he's healthy, about whether he's not so healthy, whether his heart is going to hold out, et cetera, et cetera. And the question is, I mean, there's no doubt, let's say he makes it perfectly well through the 6-year sexennial. However, he is going to, everyone keep their fingers crossed, leave at the end of 6 years. And then what happens to this party that is winning all these governorships? What happens to this party who's expected to win half, 50% of the lower house of Congress and even a greater percentage of the Senate? Will this party survive the exit from politics of its leader? Now you might say, well, he won't leave politics after 6 years. But if he's, what would he be, 72, 74? His ability to influence politics definitely goes down with age. Just ask Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, and you will know that. All right, so what do these results mean for the Mexican party system? Well, in terms of state populations, I'm going to show you some data on that, about how many voters are going to live under Morena governors, pre-governors, PAN governors, from these new election results. And what we're going to see is that Morena does extremely well. In terms of INE money, INE is the National Electoral Institute and gives out quite a bit of public money for campaign finance and for regular party activities. So the legal money, for the federal elections at least, and the national parties comes from INE. So how does INE determine this money? Through the results of the lower house of Congress. So if you do poorly in the lower house of Congress, your national party structure gets less money from the public institution, which is a bad thing. Next, in terms of midterm elections, we've already spoken about that. This combines, however, with re-election. And so what we don't know is what is going to happen to all these Morena candidates. You have to be renominated by the same party because the politicians in Mexico are geniuses and they know how to write stupid electoral rules. So just so the parties don't lose control over their candidates, we're going to force them to be renominated by the same party. That will probably break apart after several electoral cycles. But for now, what you're going to see is a certain amount of power from all those Morena candidates just because of re-election. So really, the Morena, the governor's elections being aligned with the presidential elections, realigned with AMLO, could not have come at a worse time, because this will be, these candidates who were elected in 2008 will be able to stand for re-election in 2021. So this is what is such an odd sort of moment that the stars have aligned. So the next question is, we've asked a question about AMLO and Morena. Now I'm going to ask a question about the PRI. The PRI, let's just assume it wins Yucatan, it loses Jalisco, it will stand at roughly about 13 states. The problem for the PRI is that these are far smaller states. The only state that's left in its crown of big, powerful, lots of numbers, lots of money, is the state of Mexico with about 17 million voters. They almost lost that election. And the question will be, what's going to happen in that state's midterm elections, which will happen, I think, in a year and a half or 2 years. How can the PRI survive if it loses its governors? In 2000, the PRI didn't fall apart as many expected it to. Why? Because it held between 19 and 21 governorships, 19 and 21 states out of 32, including all the largest states. What that meant was that when the PRI governors saw local and federal elections come up, they helped their candidates. This will no longer happen in at least 8 of those 21 states it held. So, now, is the PRD dead? This is so mean. But let me just show you what I put up in 2012 when I came to the Wilson Center to give a talk right after the elections. And this is what I said. Look at this. This is a bad thing. This thing doesn't work. Well, it sort of doesn't work. Look at the PRI. This was 2012. So look at the PRI. In all 5 circumscriptions, these are like multi-member districts. So these are the different regions that Jorge was talking about in his talk. So what you have is in the Northwest, which is wealthier, and where the PAN has governors, they did okay. The PAN did well in the Northeast. Even though its presidential candidate lost, they still did pretty well. And then they did badly in the Southeast, in DF is what Mexico City used to be called, and Michoacan and Mexico State. And then the PRI does well everywhere, except for Mexico City, because the PRD ate all of that. And then the PRD literally won no no majority districts in these regions. Each region holds about 3 to 5 states, okay? It won not a single majority seat in the lower house of Congress in these 2 regions. And then it only did well in the 4th region, which is where Mexico City used to be, or is. Well, guess what? Now Mexico City is no longer a PRD bastion. So what's going to happen to those 41 districts that it was able to win under under AMLO as a presidential candidate, it's going to disappear. The PRD as a party is on its way out. Now, it's still being held up because it's in an alliance with the PAN at the presidential level and in some governors, some states. However, this is a short-term alliance. The PAN and the PRD are on opposite sides of the ideological spectrum. This is not like a normal, natural alliance. This was an anti-AMLO alliance that has not done very well. So we need to start worrying about the PRD as a party as well. And then these are sort of population gains. If Morena is at the top, if it wins Puebla but not Veracruz, it will win basically 25 million new voters. The only sense that they will be living under a Morena governor, okay? If the PRI wins Yucatan, then it will have 2 million voters out of all of these voters in this election cycle. If the PAN wins Veracruz and Guanajuato, 14 million, and Movimiento Ciudadano is Jalisco at 8 million. So I just want to end up on a note here. If we don't have governors from sort of major parties able to win elections anymore, or fewer than normal, what is going to happen to the Mexican party system? One of the problems here is that the party system, despite all the problems with the actual parties and the party leadership, they have been able to maintain, it was over 90% of votes and seats up until I think 2015, and then it fell to 80. But if Eric is correct and it falls to 50%, that is a huge drop-off in large party ownership over majority districts. So who cares? Why could that be a problem? You know, I have a colleague who's an economist, and he's all for, you know, like choice is good. Well, in fact, what are you choosing? Are you choosing the PES candidate, or are you just choosing for the alliance? Do you actually know about this Morena candidate? Who knows? Do you like the PT? Who knows? There are a bunch of small parties that, in fact, do not represent, ideologically speaking, many voters. If their numbers rise and the traditional party numbers fall, we could be looking at basically, I wouldn't say the collapse yet of the Mexican party system, but a dramatic change and a weakening of the traditional parties. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joy. Well, three presentations that really do bear out the title of this event, that is going to be a historic vote. Thank you, all three of you. I'm going to pose three questions, one to each of you, and then I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. The first one, Jorge, for you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the undecideds. It's still a significant number of voters who haven't decided yet, and how you think that's going to pan out, or PRD out, or Morena out, in that case, in the election on Sunday. For Joy, I was going to ask you what happens to the PRI, but you answered that question. So I want to ask this question. Do you see it that it's likely that Morena can win a majority of state legislatures by 2021? Because that's a key date. I mean, there'll be a midterm election in 2021, and of course, Andrés Manuel has said that he will not attempt any constitutional reforms in the first half of his mandate because, well, he wouldn't be able to get it because he doesn't have a majority of state legislatures. Will he have it by the second half of his mandate? And lastly for you, Eric, Joy talked about the end of the PRI. How do you see the PRI behaving in Congress with this greatly reduced position? And do you see a mass desertion from the PRI? Or from other parties as well, if you like, at that point. Jorge.
Well, good that you mentioned the undecided. There is a lot of debate in Mexico about what it means not to answer the question about electoral preference. And let's say that the proper term is people who do not declare an electoral preference. People or the media sometimes confuse this with undecided, but actually the precise term is item non-response. That is, people do not answer the question, and it becomes a black box that says that That includes people who say, oh, well, I haven't made up my mind, but we also have there people that say, ninguno, none of these candidates, I'm not going to vote, the vote is secret. So when you look at, for instance, the 20%, which on average do not give us an answer to the electoral preference question, I would say that about 8 percentage points of the electorate are really undecided in the classical sense. But the thing is that many of them are undecided on many other issues. They don't give us an opinion about the parties, about the candidates. I would say that this is people that are alienated from the political system and that actually are not going to vote. So I wouldn't expect that things would change because of this 20% of people that says that or do not give us an answer to the electoral preference question. But on the other hand, we have some other items in the polls which say, have you made up your mind, or is it possible that you change your electoral preference? And in that sense, we still have about 30% of the electorate that is still uncertain, that do have an electoral preference, but it's not a very solid electoral preference. When you look at the profile of these people, you see that they don't like the PRI, but they are torn between López Obrador and Ricardo Anaya. But I don't see any evidence that this could alter dramatically the figures that we are already seeing in the polls.
Great, thank you. Before you answer, Joy, I'd just like to say, whoever's phone keeps going off, maybe you can't hear it, but I can. If you could, every phone has a silent button, so it's just on the side there if you'd like to use that. Joy.
All right. Keep on yelling at them because I need to count one more thing. 1, 2, all right, 2.
You got it?
I got it. All right. Quick like a bunny, I went and looked up the answer to your question. And what is interesting here is that as go the governorships, so go the majority in the state legislatures. So it's very odd to have like a pan governor and a pre-majority, or have a pan governor and not have a pan majority in the state legislature. So almost always, but not always, if you have a strong governor, you will also have a majority in your state assembly. Now, this matters, as Duncan mentioned, because in order to change the Constitution, you need to send that piece of legislation not only through a supermajority of the House and Congress, but you also need to send it through a supermajority of the states. So the state legislatures vote on that constitutional changing piece of legislation, which would be very difficult for AMLO or López Obrador to do, because he would only have, let's say, 5 to 6 states, so he wouldn't be able to necessarily get any sort of supermajority of the state congresses. Now, what would obviously matter is whether governors would be able to negotiate or would be willing to negotiate with the López Obrador presidency. Now, it may be for certain things, you know, you would change the Constitution, but what really matters here is whether you're sort of willing to become, as I like to say, you know, AMLO is not going to be another Chavez. Mexico won't be another Venezuela, but Mexico, you know, could potentially become another Philippines, right? With weak parties and with a very strong presidency. I'm not saying that López Obrador is an authoritarian or an autocrat. I'm simply saying if you have weaker parties, you can expect stronger presidents. And in the Latin American case, that's a bad thing. So to answer your question, I would say that no, I don't see any hope of Morena winning anything close to a majority of state legislatures in the short term.
By 2021?
No.
No? Okay.
No, that's pretty short term.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Eric.
Thank you. And just to make some counterpoint to what Joy just said, because you're asking about the behavior of the PRI slate in Congress. And well, we're talking here about the kings and queens of pragmatism. Mostly kings, I guess, but I mean, they've basically been non-ideological since they were born. And what will happen, I mean, I think the answer passes through Joy's question, because governors have been pivotal in legislative careers in Mexico since, at least in the democratic era. And what will happen with all these PRI federal deputies and governors when Mexico will be pretty cash-strapped, I guess, next in the coming few years out of the world economy's slowdown, the end of NAFTA and whatever comes, and they will be having a hard time, I guess, getting funded. Mexican government, state governments are basically funded by the federation. And so you need to have good connections to get money for your states, and it's not unlikely, actually, that these remnants of the PRI will play their pragmatism and actually join Morena pretty eagerly and fast. So maybe that actually might change what Joy was saying. They may not have majorities elected on their own, but they might inherit at least good pieces of the PRI. But who knows?
Thank you, Eric. Questions from the audience? One right here, one at the back there. We got a microphone up front here. Thank you. Wouldn't mind introducing yourself?
Oh, of course. Blake Vieira, Department of Justice. So I have two questions for the whole panel. Topically, they're unrelated, but just a couple burning questions. In relation to Pemex, as they are trying to become, diversify and become more competitive, at least in the American oil market, both north and south, what are the implications if Obrador wins in a week for Pemex? Second question is, coincidentally, this is also timed with the Turkish presidential election, and I'm wondering if Mexico can expect the same threats of voting irregularities that have been seen in other quote-unquote democracies in other parts of the world going at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. And a question for the gentleman at the back with his hand up right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian Muelling, US EPA. I thank you for this really good presentation. Two questions as well. Could someone please provide a quick illustration of what the typical voter turnout is in a presidential election in Mexico, and what the trends have looked like recently, and how you think that might be playing out going into the future, just in general? And the second question is, if I understand correctly, the new administration takes office on the 1st of December. Could you provide some hint as to when one might anticipate seeing people identified for key positions of authority, et cetera, and how that might play out?
Thank you. Excellent questions. Do we have a third? Yes, please. Right here, sir.
John Suarez, Freedom House. My question is, if AMLO wins, what consequences would it be for the relationship between Mexico and Cuba and the region at large?
Thank you. Who would like to lead off? Jorge?
Okay. I'll start with the turnout question. In the past presidential elections, turnout has been between 58–66%. If I'm not wrong, 6 years ago it was 66%. We should expect, as Joy was mentioning, that there should be an increase in turnout because of concurrent elections. Now, this is something that we didn't mention, but 30 out of the 32 states will have local elections on July 1st. In the past, 12 years ago, we had an increase in turnout. States with concurrent elections have a turnout rate 4 percentage points higher than the rest of the country. Given this, we should expect turnout in this election to be around 70%. And something that it's very important to keep in mind, it is that unlike the US, electoral registration do not show any bias or any partisan bias. For instance, in the US, you have minorities that are underrepresented in the electoral roll because of difficulties with registration. In Mexico, part of the electoral history is that there was not a partisan bias in the registration process. So we don't see that many differences in electoral results because of turnout. So this is going to be an election where a lot of people are going to turn out, and I don't expect this to be a major explanation if things do not go as expected by, as predicted by the polls. In terms of irregularities, I was just looking this morning about the party representatives at the polling booths. We are going to have about 150,000 polling booths installed in Mexico on July 1st. And it seems that Morena has, will have representatives at about 90% of those polling booths, a number similar to the PRI. And at the same time, the PAN and the PRD will have also a major presence in the polling booths. So this is going to be a closely watched election in terms of party representatives. And also another thing to keep in mind is that the authorities at the polling booths, I mean, that is the officials, the people who count the votes are citizens randomly selected by the National Electoral Institute. So that's another guard against the possibility of fraud. And I think the question about Pemex, you are the best one to answer it.
If you don't mind, I have, on the topic of irregularities in Mexico, is it more common for paper ballots to be cast, or is it more electronic as seen in some other countries?
No, it's all paper ballot.
Joy.
I would like to answer the irregularity question. I think it's important to know that most of the irregularities are going to happen during the actual campaign, not so much on voting day. And why? Because vote stealing, which is what the PRI used to do in part, was replaced by vote buying in large part. So the vote buying is sort of happening as we speak. That sounds so dramatic. And everything. It's been going on for, like, let's say the last month, right? And so the vote buying, it's not 100% effective. There are many problems for the parties as they try to buy people's vote. It's not a perfect system. And so it remains to be seen whether the vote buying will be enough for certain states, certain state legislatures, et cetera. And the second thing is, in terms of irregularities, it's very difficult for INE, which is the electoral authority, to actually fiscally sort of check as the campaign goes on how much informal or illegal spending is being done. So that makes it extremely difficult. You know, there was a study done by Integralia a couple of years ago where they thought that each vote, for what it officially costs, it was something on the order of 2 to 3 times more. So that tells you, and that's just the federal deputies, that's not even the presidency. But I think most importantly is something we really haven't mentioned here very much, which is in various parts of various regions of Mexico, the drug trade organizations or criminal drug trade organizations have been very active in making their preferences for certain candidates known. And how do they do that? By murdering them or trying to murder them. And this is a real issue when you're speaking of, I've heard both the 200 and the 120 figure for a longer period of time versus 45 for, I think, the actual campaign period or something like that. So what that means is that it's not that those candidates who are left alive in those districts or those municipalities are necessarily pro-narco. It doesn't mean that at all. But what it means is probably they're certainly not anti-narco. Or it could mean that they're on the right, they're on the side of the narco group that's strongest in that area. You know, basically we don't really know that much. So I would argue that in terms of, comparing Mexico to Turkey, I think it's probably a lot different. However, there is voting irregularity, just not in the sense of vote stealing.
Well, I'd like to take the cabinet question. There's a big difference, two big differences between the Mexico and the US at least. First is that there's a 5-month period between the election and inauguration, and I think that must be a world record in waiting, no? And so there's time to actually negotiate lots and lots of things in that during that time. And the other difference is that there's few cabinet posts that need a congressional confirmation. So they basically can be appointed right off. So that said, I think we should have a full cabinet basically on December 2nd or 3rd, no? That's basically how it's worked in Mexico. And just to take, I have no idea of US-Cuban, what to expect there. That's not really my area. But on the irregularity side, I think I would just add one thing. Then there's lots and lots of vote buying going on, as Joy was saying, but every party participates in it. López Obrador loves to boast about his earlier elections have been being stolen from his by fraud, and there's basically no evidence of that. All parties participate in vote buying, and it's basically they annul each other, no? That's my take on it.
A very brief word on voting irregularities. I saw a video that was going around on social media this morning, civil society group that's been set up in Mexico, telling Mexican voters to accept the money in exchange for buying the vote, but then to go into the polling booth, mark the choice, to take a photograph of it, and put a V on it, which will indicate that it has been sold. It's a sold vote, so it won't count. And you'll be able to do this. The electoral authorities will be able to have an idea who was buying votes afterwards. I thought it was a very pragmatic approach. Whether or not people will do that or not, I don't know. Just very briefly on Pemex, under an Andrés Manuel government, I think that we're likely to see freezing to the oil contracts, not the ones already issued, but no new oil auctions. There will be a focus on Pemex, but he doesn't have any money to put into it, so he either does that by further indebting the government or by further indebting Pemex, and there are limitations to that. And there'll be a significant amount of tinkering around the edges with regulation and potentially secondary legislation as well, okay, on that one. I think we have, and Cuba, I'm really sorry, I don't think we have anybody here who's going to be able to answer your question. My own response to that is that I don't think Andrés Manuel is particularly interested in foreign policy. I don't think he's particularly interested in the Bolivarian revolution. There are people in his party who are. There are people in his party who have spent a lot of time in Venezuela and continue to associate with folks from the Maduro regime. But Andrés Manuel, at least recently, has been quite disciplined. He refuses to reject the Bolivarian revolution, but he also doesn't speak in favor of it. And so his attitude to Cuba, I think, may well be similar to that. Ultimately, I think he's going to be quite pragmatic. What does Cuba give him? Cuba can offer quite a lot to a country like Venezuela, but not really so much to a country like to Mexico, in the way I see it. But that's an uninformed opinion. Got a couple of questions. Yes, we're going to have Dolia, and then gentleman here, and lady at the back there. If you could be as quick as possible, because we're running out of time.
Sure. I'm Dolia Esteves. I'm a freelance journalist based here in Washington. And a few weeks ago, we had here Maria Amparo Casar, and she spoke about the risks of considering the result of this, of this election as inevitable. It says, she says, all the polls have obviously been saying or telling us for many months that AMLO is to win. But she said, don't think about it as a done deal. She left a big question mark whether that was going to be the case. And she discussed the issue of the undecided vote. Jorge mentioned some of that, but do you think this is a done deal that AMLO for sure is winning on Sunday and there's no way around?
Great, thank you. Second question?
Thank you. My name is Anshu. I'm a reporter with Inside U.S. Trade. My question is about the NAFTA negotiations. I'm just curious if the panel can comment on what an AMLO win on July 1st could mean for that in terms of the substance and the timing. In other words, would he demand sort of substantive changes to Mexico's position in the talks? And if not, could we, or if, and also could we see maybe a break, a long break while his team gets into place? Thank you.
Thank you. And then a last question from the back here.
I was wondering if the panel could address the PT and the PES. It looked like they gave up quite a lot of, or Morena gave up quite a lot of spaces for them in order to have this coalition. What kind of policies could they be looking at having to, work on with these two groups?
Thank you very much. 3 very quick answers.
Okay, it is a done deal. I think that the chances that López Obrador loses the election are very slim. I mean, you have El País forecast, which considers an error of plus minus 12 percentage points for the polls, and it still gives 95% chance of López Obrador to win. The Oráculos considers more reduced error for the polls, plus minus 5 percentage points, and it's about 99%. So it can happen, yes. It is likely, it is not likely that he will lose the election.
Thank you. Joy.
I'll take very quickly the policy options of the PT and the PES. As I was saying, the smaller parties are not known for their policy demands or their policy promises. These are not what you'd call ideologically really active parties. What they tend to be, especially PT, they tend to be parties that are created by the resource incentives, the monetary incentives that ENA gives to new parties and to existing parties. And so these are not normally seen as policy powerhouses, i.e. they don't give very many ideas. The only question here is maybe PES as an evangelical party. I honestly don't think Mexico is a very evangelical country. It's becoming far less religious rather than more religious, and I don't see a very small party changing that in the near future. Thank you.
I would also start with the smaller parties' positions. It's a very little what we know of them. They've been ultra small and not policy oriented. But I think there's one instance in the past that actually raises more doubts than it answers. It's the Green Party that has been systematically allied with the PRI for over 15 years, if not more. And curiously, they haven't. I mean, if you think of the German liberals, they are a tiny party that allies with other parties, and they tend to make policy demands systematically. They get cabinet positions. They actually play the government role. The Green I mean, they have one governor. They won one governorship in Chiapas, but that's it. They've never actually demanded more. So I'm not sure if the new parties will actually behave in the same way and actually not play the policy game and basically get money or something else. And about the done deal, I think we can be sure. I mean, the presidential race, I think, is hard to turn around, and there's more uncertainty about the other races. But I think this is a very unlikely campaign at least in the Mexican recent tradition, where there's very little that can be actually changed from here to next Sunday.
Great. Thank you. On NAFTA, you had a
NAFTA,
question. Hang out there. I don't know if anybody wants to take it on NAFTA. I mean, all I would say is if you read Andrés Manuel's statements about NAFTA, he's moderated his position extraordinarily over the past few years. He recognizes that NAFTA has probably been good for Mexico, but it needs to be improved. He believes, that, at least in his statements, that he should be the one to improve it. Now, of course, his dream situation would have been that it was all wrapped up before he came into office, because having to negotiate it, particularly against a Trump administration, is going to be very, very difficult. He has said that he will accept whatever the current negotiating team has negotiated up to this point, that he respects the work that they've done, and he's picked a chief negotiator, Jesus Seade, who is a recognized and respected economist. His pick for economy minister, Graciela Marquez, is a respected economist as well, left-leaning, but certainly orthodox. So I think that we should expect that, given he recognizes how important NAFTA is for Mexico's prosperity, that he would try to save NAFTA if he possibly could. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us. Please thank our participants.